All right, everybody, we're going to continue on with Latin America Part Two, and we're going to start with the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution is very interesting because this is really a response to this fallout of, Spanish rule over Mexico. Mexico had been free of Spain for almost a century at this point, not quite, I think more around 85 to 90 years. And um, what had happened in Mexico is that eventually, in 1876, a man by the name of Porfirio Diaz takes control, and he is essentially a dictator. And he rules over Mexico, and he allows the United States to do basically whatever they want to do in Mexico because he's going to benefit from it. He's going to benefit from this American investment in Mexico. And people of Mexico, the normal sort of middle class Mexicans, do not like this because basically most of the land in Mexico was either owned by the United States or it was owned by the Catholic Church. And uh, then you have these varying figures that are going to rise up and become very interesting players in the Mexican Revolution. Uh, Francisco Madero is the initial leader, and we're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of the Mexican Revolution because, while here it says it's 1910 to 1920, realistically, the Mexican Revolution continues until the 1940s. But Madero is going to call for redistribution of land, that the middle class needs to have a say. And then you have Emiliano Zapata, who is down in an area called Chiapas, and he's going to represent an indigenous movement in Mexico. And then in the north of Mexico, you're going to have the very colorful character of Pancho Villa. And they all lead different factions in the revolution, and they all infight and everything else. But what the Mexican Revolution is really about is establishing rights for the middle class and the indigenous people of Mexico. And in the 1917 Constitution, um, it established social and labor rights. It also said that Americans can't own land in Mexico. So if you sitting here right now today, unless you get Mexican citizenship, if someone tries to sell you land in Mexico, you can't own it because Americans aren't allowed to own land in Mexico. Also, through this period, we're going to see various labor movements, and you're going to see urbanization that's going to occur. Mexico, other Latin American countries are going to start to modernize, just as other countries across the world are going to do as well. And with modernization and with industrialization comes labor issues. I mean, those poor working conditions, and uh, you're going to start to see influences coming from Europe that are going to start to poke up, and some Marxian theory, socialist theory, also anarchist ideas, and those are people that just want kind of chaos that are going to influence these labor movements. And some of these labor parties are going to become very, very powerful and influence elections throughout Latin America. Um, as the same thing happened in the United States when there was rapid urbanization, meaning that cities start to grow rapidly and people start moving from the country, from the rural areas to the urban areas. It causes all sorts of issues. It means that people are going to have, there's things such as sewer systems. That's a very simple one. But there's also crime, there's discrimination, there's, housing issues. And so these governments are not necessarily equipped to deal with it. And when the governments can't deal with it, that starts to lead to protests in the streets. It starts to lead to more problems. You start to see governments being overthrown. And this will certainly be the case in Mexico, where it will happen numerous times. Uh, in Argentina, for instance, you have student movements. Now, student movements become huge in the United States in the 1960s, but In Argentina at the Cordoba University reform in 1918, um, they demand that the university be allowed to operate freely and independently from the government and let ideas reign free. And in many ways, Latin American countries were ahead of the curve when it came to some of these ideas that would later become synonymous with the United States, like I said, in the 1960s. Uh, and the youth movement in Latin America took place a lot earlier than the youth movement did here, and in many cases a lot earlier than the rest of the world as well. And part of that was just because those nations were so young that they were still forming, and every students, youth, people in their young people thought that they had should have a voice and how those countries would operate going forward. Well, as we look at point four, economic transformation and global influences, the impact of World War One. What happened with World War One is this: because Europe couldn't necessarily trade with Latin America anymore, Latin American countries had to rely on the United States more. Um, so it's kind of a double-edged sword here. These countries are going to have to rely on the United States to be their customer. But also, since they can't get goods from Europe, they're also going to see industrialization because they have to make the goods themselves. So there is a good and a bad aspect to this. It was, by most counts, a temporary boom period for a lot of the Latin American countries out there because they had to fill the gaps of what Europe couldn't supply. If all of a sudden you'd been relying on Europe to supply your, I don't know, let's say shovels, now you have to manufacture your own shovels. So all of a sudden, foundries are built, and there's a new industry in Latin America. Um, it is War moves things forward, and it's a sad reality that it takes things as extreme as a war to do that oftentimes. But it is the case that very, very often a conflict, a war, will move the needle of history forward. Not only in industrialization, but technology, sometimes even social issues. For instance, in the United States, World War II is seen as a massive boost to the African American civil rights movement. And so these things occur, and it happened in Latin America with World War One. The Great Depression um, was just as hard for Latin America as it was for everybody else. They had built up these World War One industries, and then now they can't. There's no way to export because the global economies are collapsing. And so what are we going to do? There's not much you can do in this case. Uh, what you do see during this period is that the Great Depression is going to increase the role of the government in the economy. Um, so this not only leads to jobs programs, but let's look at Mexico, for instance. In Mexico, um, Pemex controls the petroleum industry, and that is a state-run, government-run industry. So it's not like here in the United States where you have Exxon or Texaco or whatever. Their government controls it. And the same thing would go as telephones started to develop, and various other industries would be run by the state. Now, this is a socialist policy. And so socialism starts to really take hold throughout Latin America at this period. Um, Now, also during this period, you see the rise of populism. Leaders like Getulio Vargas in Brazil, Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. Um, Cardenas would become, or Cardenas would become a president of Mexico. And they do so by appealing to the masses. And, he nationalizes the oil industry, as I said, Pemex. But populism, you have to think about, is power to the people, right? I am promoting that I'm going to listen to the people and what the people want, I'm going to give them. Doesn't always work, but in this case, it was pretty pretty popular and it worked quite well in several countries, Brazil and Mexico being two of those key examples. Um, and there also be social welfare programs. And this is really kind of a prelude to what will happen in the United States during the FDR administration, when we start to put in these sort of programs to get us through the Great Depression. Latin America is going to be again ahead of the curve on a lot of this. Now, as I said before, ideas like fascism, communism, socialism start to influence Latin America. Uh, you start to see the rise of pseudo dictators, not dictators in the sense of like Hitler or Mussolini or anything like that, but for instance, I will give you an example. Um, in Mexico, while it's not a dictator, the same political party ruled Mexico from, I believe it was 1936 to 2000. Same political party. It would be like if the Republicans or Democrats were in control of the United States for 7 decades. So it's not a dictatorship per se, but it is an ideological dictatorship. And so that really differentiates what happened in Latin America versus other parts of the world. Okay, so let's summarize the key points here. U.S. dominance in the region. You have the emergence of national and social movements, massive economic changes, how they reacted to World War I, the Great Depression. These are all going to shape Latin American history. Um, Throughout it all, these Latin American countries have continued to exist and mostly peacefully with one another. Now, not always peacefully with other countries, like especially the United States. Now, we haven't gone to war or anything, but for the most part, there has been peaceful existence between all the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Um, and while we will look at some of these countries and say that it looks kind of like a dictatorship, they're not really. They are still democracies, but they are kind of, I don't know, I'm not trying to, they are kind of democracies that are not quite 100% true. So, the period laid foundations for modern Latin American political and economic systems. There's still many struggles throughout Latin America. Poverty runs rampant in parts of Latin America. I personally wrote my master's thesis on the continual battle between the indigenous people of Chiapas versus the Mexican central government in the 1990s. Um, and they would continue to function. And I think in the United States, we have this very skewed view that Latin America is somehow completely dysfunctional and based upon immigration or whatever, but that's just really not the case. There are massive periods of dysfunction in Latin America, but there's also massive stability as well throughout the region. Well, at the end of this lecture outline, there are some key terms for you to look at, and I hope you guys are going to have a great spring break. That is all for today. Take it easy, be safe, and make good decisions.